What's up? I'm Stavish, and this is how I produce Need Another. Alright, this is Need Another, and as always, I thought I would start out by playing the track from the top.
I need another. I need another. I need another. I said I need another.
All right, let's break it down. So there's a few key sections I wanted to hit on, and the first is the drums. So when I wrote, or at least started writing this track, I was taking a class called Groove Theory, and it inspired me to play around with all sorts of different drums and different patterns. And just to sort of talk through the end result here, I guess I'll just isolate kick and snare first. Nothing too crazy there. But if we pivot to the percussion sounds, you can start to hear a lot more going on. Cool. So talking through this just layer by layer really quick. The fills is just sort of a massive drum rack that I throw a lot of like one shots in and play around with like different hits to see how that sounds. Looks like I just sort of used like a one-off snare that's not like the main snare, but just to like fill in and sort of be maybe like a precursor to the main hit or something that happens right after the main snare. In context with just the percussion. Claps, just two claps layered. I like something usually maybe a little bit more like direct and down the middle, and then something with more of like a wider high end. Yeah, and then sometimes just like EQing to only take the frequencies that you are looking for in each of those claps to make sure there's not too much overlap, but you're sort of getting a cool blend of both of them. It just looks like a hi-hat pattern I penciled and froze. Just a little swoop up. It's maybe not even percussion, but it went with the group. So this is what's driving a lot of the like groove and energy for the percussion. And what you're seeing from a audio visual perspective is not actually what you are hearing. So this visually is what the sample is. And if I play it by itself, we can do some comparison. So this is what I have. And if I go find the original sample, there's a few more hits going on. And how I did that was warp it to beats mode, and then you set the preserve amount and switch this to point forward, as well as sort of a like dry wet amount. And this specific sort of like setting is going to preserve the eighth note transients, and then at 100 it's going to pretty much remain untouched, allowing sort of everything to come through. And if you have this dialed down to 0, we can do that here. You're going to hear really just sort of clicks on the eighth note from whatever the sample sounds like right on those eighth notes. Yeah, so you can see how playing around with that value can really either like tone a sample back or give you sort of at least different options for getting those different preserve amounts out of a sample. And you can do this with percussion sounds. I often do it with the vocals if you sort of want to get like a stuttering or vocal chop type effect. And how I used this throughout the track is just either dialing in different preserve amounts or different value settings here. So I think this one as an example, yeah, set to quarter. So if you solo this here, and that was sort of a trick I did, is I found a sample and it really fit well with the groove of the track, and then putting it into beats mode, playing around with the preserve effects just allows me to get different variations of that same sample. And so in context altogether,
I need another. I need another.
and that's how I made the drums. So the second section I wanted to talk about was the vocal. There's a lot of processing going on, and let's strip all the processing back and sort of hear what it sounded like when it was recorded. So I can do this. Cool. And then I think this layer is pitched up an octave and these are pitched down an octave. So I can dial this.
I said I need another.
And that is me. That's my vocal. And I think I had played around with a lot of samples, different packs, throwing different sounds, different vocals at this track. Wasn't really sure what I was looking for. None of the samples were really fitting the vibe, so I just set up the mic, had it running, and thought I'd play back the track a few times, see what comes out. And next thing I know, sort of went out with the phrase, I need another, and it went from there. And it looks like, if I remember, these are all the times I recorded. So you can see it wasn't like a very large recording session. This was just on my desk, not like in a booth or anything. But I had this take that I liked, and then I sort of went to town with it like it was a sample, really just sort of like using my own vocal as like a one-shot sample, not just trying to create different variations and sort of sing through the different sections. But I said a phrase, I liked it, and then just processed it, slice and dice it up throughout the track, just making it really like in your face, high energy dance floor track. That's the vibe of this. So from recording state here,
I said I need another.
I pitched it up an octave,
I said I need another.
and then did a bunch of processing. So all together,
I said I need another.
and we can break this up quick. Okay, so the first thing I did was just tune my vocal, and I'm just sending it straight through a real-time tuner here. Put into the key of the track, D Phrygian. CPU doesn't like all this right now, but if I need to be more meticulous with very specific notes, whether that is the note they're playing or the timing or the length of that note, I'd probably go into something more like Melodyne. But this, I'm just sending the whole vocal through it and saying, adjust anything that really isn't in the key and make sure that we are roughly in place there. Then to give it a lot of the textures, I used Vocal Synth, just giving it extra grit and layers. So it takes the original vocal, and then I'm applying all of these sort of additional layers with their own different processing to give it more of that like grit and process sound that we're hearing. So without Vocal Synth.
I said I need another.
And then with Vocal Synth.
I said I need another.
And you can get all sorts of really cool effects with this, and there's all sorts of cool presets. So depending on the, more over-the-top distortion type vocals to maybe just adding a little bit of chorus or delay type effects, this is a cool tool to play around with. From there, just some compression, EQ cleanup. Looks like I'm automating a filter at different times, probably during the build sections. Yeah. And then controlling the stereo width with an imager. So I have a doubler, and this is automated. Looks like I just have this on during the build and the drops, and this is going to just sort of create a little bit of delay or difference in the left and the right, maybe just changing up the stereo width a little bit, and thought that was a nice change up from the verse to the build sections. Moving on from there, just doing a little bit of de-essing after the fact there. Didn't use this. More EQ, more filter automation happening at a different part of the track. And then frequency shifter. So one of my favorite tools. It looks like, I think my initial recording was, like I need another, and that was fine. Once I had recorded and started playing around with this, I was really just treating that vocal like a one-shot sample. So I wasn't going around and trying to, re-record additional takes and get different variations of that out. I sort of kept the same recording and then played around with all sorts of different effects to get different results. And here I was trying to pick up the vocal into the build. So just frequency shifting it up during this section. You can hear with this now.
I said I need another.
So you can hear it go up there, and then if I turn this off,
I said I need another.
yeah, it even sounds like it's dipping down, but that was just how I sang it, and then frequency shifting that to really just drive the energy back up. More filtering, and then a reverb. So felt a little dry going into like certain sections, so this is what carries that vocal.
I said I need another.
Carrying right now, that's the reverb. If I turn this off,
I said I need another.
hard stop. So that is everything on the vocal. This is the same, just an octave down.
I said I need another.
So then together,
I said I need another.
CPU doesn't like all that, but I think you sort of get how the main vocal was built. And then the part that is a sample, it's not myself, is this bumpa, and hearing that by itself. I think I was just looking for some variation to what I said and trying to think about like what would work well with like I need another. And I came across this sample and it was like bumpa, and I was like, that could be kind of funny, kind of catchy. Played around with it. I applied all or pretty much all the same processing to the sample as my vocal to get it in a much more similar like sonic space. And just to show what the original sample sounded like.
Bumper, yo, bumper, yo, bump.
So that's the original clean sample, and then after all the processing, you can hear the difference between the original sample and what I ended up doing with it, and that just sort of got the sample to be a lot more similar to my recorded vocal and how that turned out to be. So all the vocals together in context. So that is the vocal. All right, one more piece I wanted to dive into before we do the drop, and that's the arpeggiator. There's not a whole lot of like obvious chords to this track. I always write a song around chords, and then we'll take like certain pieces, you know, like the drop is very just like maybe like the top voice of the chord driven, and then like the sub is like a lot of the root primarily. But the arpeggiator allowed me to really like play around with the sort of like the chord selection here. And as I mentioned, I'm in D Phrygian, and probably doing the 2 because the 2 in the scale for Phrygian is really what gives it that Phrygian tone, because the 1 and the 2 are only a semitone apart. And then it looks like I'm just dropping down to the 7 from there. So 1, 2, 7 progression. And the arpeggiator, I have a few layers, but just here, let's solo these. Yeah, and then the lead is just playing like a singular set of notes found within the same progression. And then there's a filter over that because that's just the build section there, teasing what's going to come in the drop. All right, so the arpeggiator. Using Max for Live's arpeggiator, I liked the way this sounded when I threw it on, but I also flip between just the stock Ableton arpeggiator, not like a hard fan between one or the other. And we can open up the Serum patch. Let me just disable all the post-processing first. So just Serum. And then processing. Just sounds like a little bit more echo, a little bit more shine on the top. What I'm doing in Serum just looks like very, very quick attack, no sustain, and kind of just gave it that sprinkling effect. I was doing a little bit of portamento on this, so maybe that is what is causing the notes to almost sound like they're pulling into each other a little bit. And from an effects, you know, just a few standard selections to try to like liven up the sounds. All right, then post-processing, echo. So that's just, you know, adding more scatter to the individual hits, so it's not just like clean 16th notes, but we have some additional notes sort of like trickling after the effect. Looks like just reverb directly on the channel here. EQ for cleanup, really just looking for like the mids and highs on this arpeggiator. A lot of other like low and mid content coming from the other selections, or I should say the other instruments and sounds in the song. Overdrive, just brightening up the mids and highs. So this is a multi-band compression tool, and I'm actually using it for side chaining the vocal. When the vocal plays, the arpeggiator is going to dip in these frequencies, just sort of making a little bit of a pocket for that vocal to sit in. So if we play just the vocal and the arpeggiator here. Yeah, so you can see that's like really the heart of the vocal, and letting the arpeggiator shine in the upper frequencies and a little bit below that. But there was just some frequency clashing there, so this allowed me to have room for both playing at the same time. And then wrapping up the rest of the processing, looks like just doing some automation of the arpeggiator to go louder at certain times as the build is happening, the energy is rising, the volume's getting louder, so just making sure that arpeggiator shines through in the mix. And from an imaging perspective, I think I was just having some phasing in the lower and low mid bands, so just pull those down a little bit to sort of monitor that phasing amount, making sure it wasn't too much. Cool, so then all together in the mix. That's the arpeggiator of Need Another. So the last section I wanted to go through is the drop. And I did not flatten any of these layers prior to the walkthrough because I wanted to sort of showcase a lot of the automation and decisions that were made there, and I would lose those if they were flattened at this point. So just to briefly talk through the layers, everything is grouped here, and right off the bat you can see a lot of automation at the group layer, so that's affecting everything within that. And this is going to be a utility gain automation. So when it's up, you're hearing the layers, and when it cuts down, there's going to be silence, and then that just allows for a little bit more ear candy or fills from the other layers that we have going on. Soloing the drop lead synths by themselves. The lead, let's start with that. So right off the bat, you can see these are reverb automations, and that is allowing right when, at least on these two here, so the first sort of impact and then the turnaround, it's wash and reverb, and then right when that snare cracks through, the synth tightens up, no longer lost in reverb. And then just sort of automating other portions of that reverb going up just to create some changes throughout the sort of sound evolving there. Other things occurring, random serum effects automated over time. Cool, but I think let's open the layers so these make a little bit more sense. And the big one's the pitch bend. So you can see all of these layers have the same pitch bend automation occurring that we're actually getting the main sounds through. And then this is sort of like a drop filler that's ever rising throughout the drop. Opening this up, you can watch the pitch bend wheel, which is the part that's being automated for those. And I have it going up 2 octaves and down 2 octaves. So when the value is at 0.5, whatever the note is what you are hearing. But as you go up to 1 or down to 0, this is up 2 octaves, this is down 2 octaves. So that's what's giving it the rise and fall. If I take off that pitch bend automation, a little bit more boring still, a lot of sound evolving there, but just not as much going on. And this sort of shark fin pattern is giving the filter movement. So this will happen over a quarter note period and automate the filter open and close during that time. If I would change this pattern as an example, which I think we have automated as well at certain parts, that'll slow it down. So we can go, let's go 2 bars. So kind of hung around the quarter note there, and the filter is sort of getting opened up twice. It's just in a different way. So it kind of sounds like more of an eighth note because it's happening twice in the quarter note period, but this allows me to do it in different ways versus just drawing one pattern and then doing that at an eighth note rate. And then showing where it slows down, you can hear that quarter note here, then half note here. So then all that in context. So that's the lead layer, and just as far as post-processing, I'm using a comb filter on the effects here, and then I'm automating for here. This is the mix amount. So then the resonance amount is the other parameter that is being sort of automated at different times over the course of this synth. And I could have done a lot of that directly in the patch, but sometimes I will get the sound the way I want it, and then I play around with all sorts of other post-processing, not always knowing I'm going to go into Serum Effects, and it looks like that's the one I landed on here, and then just sort of started building out those other decisions in a second module. Other than that, EQ, probably, yeah, just for some cleanup, and some compression. This is what's giving it that reverb amount, so this is automated up right in the beginning there. So you can hear, once again, it's that loss in reverb, and then it gets tightened up, so it's just hard automation cuts at different times. Frequency shifters, so just doing those pitch bends up going into sort of like at the turnaround period. Dun, dun. Cool. And then not doing any utility automation on this during the drop part. And then imaging, just a lot of phasing going on in the lower bands. So tighten that up and maybe spread up the mid highs a little bit. And that's the lead for Need Another. Now, the second layer in the drop, this is similar note selections, but I wanted to sort of just like throw a bunch of different processing added to see what sort of other textures I could get. Oh, and right off the bat, we can hear what this one is. So it's very similar to the patch from Need Another. In fact, it's the same patch, but I'm taking all the notes, going up an octave, and looks like I might have made slightly different note decisions for this, but the part that's really giving it its character is Valhalla Shimmer. So Valhalla makes a lot of good reverb products, and if you're looking for just a, solid room reverb, Valhalla Shimmer is not that pick. Valhalla Shimmer gives, or at least can give, very interesting textures and tails to your sounds, and I started throwing on different sort of presets of Shimmer, and without this, we can hear what it sounds like. Kind of just like a higher pitch version of that lead, but we apply Shimmer and we maybe change some of the settings here, more of experimenting, not knowing exactly what I'm looking for, but we ended up with this. It almost sounds like you have the original sound and then something else happening a little bit on its own, a little bit more like extended sounds. So I liked that for the second half, sort of like a nice change up. So then all together in the mix, it sounded like this. Yeah, and you can hear like those little, once again, little gaps or silences. That's all caused by the utility automation just bringing the entire group down to no volume. So So that's really the second layer, and just diving in. The others are more supporting, so I often do a very high layer with the lead processing, but either like an octave or two, and then just soaked in reverb to really fill up those upper back frequencies. And then similar, but going down like an octave or two, just to give it more weight. And then the filler layer. So then all together. Cool, and that is how I produce Need Another. If you have any other questions, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you for the next one. Cheers.